for one of the candidates for the position of organizational communication in the Communication Studies Department. Our first candidate is Dr. Kathy Kelley. She is going to be doing a presentation for about 30 to 40 minutes, then there will be an opportunity for us to ask her questions. And we will be serving as the students in her classroom. I don't know what she is going to ask us to do, but we are going to cooperate with her. And we are going to assist her in whatever she asks us to do. If you would like to provide, if you're not on the search committee and you would like to provide feedback to me, you can send that to me at my email, which is lhunting@fhsu.edu. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Kathy Kelley.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Chelsea, you have to tell me, do I need to do anything with this?
No.
She good?
Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you all for being here. Crazy time of the year, and thanks for those of you that came to lunch. I know you two couldn't make it, but thank you for those that could. Today, when I was asked to give a lecture about anything in organizational communication, what is near and dear to my heart is leadership communication. So I thought I'm going to tie in some aspects of the research that I've done, but also with content that you will be learning. So with that, I will tell you what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to talk about, and all of these points that I preview relate to feedback and listening, which we'll eventually get to at the end of the presentation in the material, but communication competence is the first area that we're going to cover. Then we're going to talk about subordinate-supervisor communication. Now, usually you hear supervisor-subordinate communication, but there's a reason. It's strategic, in that order, subordinate-supervisor communication. And I'll be using interchangeably the words for subordinate, member, employee, follower, supervisor. I'll be interchangeably using for the content of this presentation and lecture, leader, supervisor, boss, manager. So for the purposes of this material for this class, they'll be used interchangeably. So if you're like, wait, I thought she was talking about supervisors and now she's saying managers, talking about the same person or same role or title. Next, we're going to talk about a theory that I find fascinating, and you probably observe it on a day-to-day basis, but I didn't know what it was called till just a few years ago, called the mum effect theory, in relation to hierarchy in the workplace, and a theory that my colleagues and I have proposed as the hierarchical mum effect. And we're going to go over hierarchy just to refresh our memories of some basic and common terms. And then what I love about organizational communication research is that you can give practical recommendations to those in an organization. So you might be asking yourselves if you've ever had a professor come in and say, will you complete this survey for me? And you can be a part of a survey where you complete the survey online. We can actually take that information and then bring it back to the workplace, bring it back to that group. So there is a reason, there is a method to the madness. It's not just for you to complete a survey at the end of the semester. So the results that you provide as either a student in a classroom or in an organization, if you're ever asked to complete a survey, researchers like myself, scholars, instructors, and teachers can go back and provide recommendations and feedback to the leaders. So we'll do that at the end, and then we'll have a discussion because I want to hear what you all have to say about some issues that I'll bring up. So first, communication competence. There are two main aspects to a message. There's task and relationship. So task is more overt, it's more obvious. You're trying to accomplish something in a message that you're sending, but then you have a relationship with the audience, the person, whether it's one person or a group of people, right? So SALT does tie in here, and I'll give you that example in just a second. You're like, SALT? Organizational communication? What? But so a competent communicator is going to be able to balance these two aspects well, keeping them both in mind. This is my task. This is the relationship I have with the person that I'm speaking with. So for example, I love this example because to me it helps, and if it doesn't with you, and if you have any questions anytime, you know, you can raise your hand and we'll try to discuss whatever the issue is at hand, or if you have a comment. That my sister-in-law, amazing chef, she was trained professionally in culinary schools in the United States and overseas. And when she was dating my brother, you know, I got to know her, but I'm one of those people, I'm like, you know, I want the relationship to happen organically. I'm not just going to be your best friend just because you're going to be my sister-in-law. And so we've been developing our relationship. They got married, now it's 5 years ago. Amazing chef. My mom's an amazing chef. My grandmother's an amazing cook. So I'm really fortunate, but I'm spoiled because I don't have to do that much cooking. I just do the dishes with my dad. So, but think about this. Now, I'm not calling myself a competent communicator per se, but by definition, let's look at this example. Say I'm sitting at the table with my sister-in-law, who's been married to my brother for 3 or 4 years, And I have a task, I'm sitting at the table, I'm eating the meal, and I want to show her that, it's a good meal, I want to keep that relationship going. The task is obviously to consume the meal. I have this task at hand, but at the same time, the task is, in order for me to consume this, say it's not up to my taste, or it's too dry, it doesn't have the right seasoning, I might need some salt. Well, what a competent communicator might say is, could someone pass the salt? What someone that's not a competent communicator is going to say, oh my gosh, this is so dry, I can't finish it. Oh my gosh, where'd you learn to cook? They wouldn't ask that, right? Because if you think about it, I'm trying to accomplish a task of consuming the meal, being at the table, holding my role, but then I want to maintain this more not as obvious relationship with my sister-in-law. I don't want to hurt her feelings. I want her to feel accepted. I want her to feel like her skills. Now, this has never happened. She cooks amazing food, but I love this example because it shows I'm trying to balance. But think about in the workplace. You need to report back to someone that oversees you. Okay, there's a task at hand. Maybe you have to report how your students are doing. Say if you're the instructor, you're the TA, maybe you oversee. I know there are some seniors of you that you will help grade papers and things like that if you have, you're a teaching assistant, but you have to report back to the teacher. And so you have to think about, I have this relationship, this professional relationship with the teacher, and I want to make sure that I represent the students and I give the instructor the proper grades and the feedback from the class, but I also have to, think about, I'm not going to probably be as direct to the instructor. I'm going to keep that in mind that this is the person that is overseeing the work that I'm doing in his or her classroom. So I think that's a great example. But in order for us to improve our communication competence, we have to make sure that we think about not just the task at hand, because that's usually the most pressing. That's the most urgent. We have to think about, who am I speaking with? Is it my supervisor? Is it my subordinate? And I know a lot of you might say, well, I don't really need to listen to this presentation because I don't want to be a leader. Well, you know what? It's important that you know this because you never know what might happen in life, and I have learned that if you say never, that's usually what's going to happen. So you need to be prepared because hopefully you're producing such great work and you're excelling that you are advanced or you're offered the opportunity to take a managerial position, or maybe you're asked to oversee a group for a group project. So that's, a position of leading to a certain extent. So it's good to keep in mind, and even if you never become a leader or a manager or a boss, it's good as a subordinate or a group member to know what communication confidence is, right? Because you can be a better evaluator of it, but then also yourself too, you can keep this in mind. So if you want to improve though, but thinking about, I know for me, with my parents, I probably would not speak to them the same way I would to a colleague, right? I'm thinking about the relationship that I have, right? That's going to dictate, that's going to influence how I communicate with my parents as opposed to how I communicate with my colleagues. Okay, before we start talking about, so we have this in mind, communication competence. Before we start talking about subordinate supervisor communication, I just want to go over a few key terms that this should be a review for all of you. But when you have in the workplace a traditional hierarchy, right? So usually, this is the more traditional, the vertical, right? You have at the top, you have supervisors, right? And then you'll have subordinates. But subordinates to subordinates, that they're going to count as, or be classified also as coworkers, right? Thank you. I heard an agreement there. Okay, so in technical terms, though, and this is, basic common sense too. Okay, if communication is going from the subordinate to the supervisor, that is called upward communication, okay? And so we'll put upward. Okay, from the supervisor down to the subordinate, that is called downward. Very good. Hopefully this is review for everyone, okay? And then when you are talking coworker to coworker, that's going to be horizontal communication, right?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so we have these basic terms in place. And by the contract, that's an agreement, right? In a workplace, and obviously it's not going to be as formal if you're in a classroom and you have a group and you have a leader, and the leader of the small group for your class is not called the supervisor unless you give each other titles. But you have to think about, too, this is an agreement, and I know in some class settings, I've heard of group members actually, they have a contract that everyone has to sign. So this is the agreement saying, this is my role, And usually that's a prescription for this is how we're going to communicate with one another. I'm the supervisor, I'm the one giving directives. Now, obviously there are exceptions. There are self-directed work teams, right? There are rotating leadership positions too. So I'm speaking traditionally though. We're talking traditionally. So I want to go over some of the material about subordinate supervisor communication that will lead us up to some research that we've done that is, I believe, very fascinating. Okay, how many of you have heard of the term FACE or FACE work? Okay, so we'll review for those, okay? So Goffman, a scholar, calls FACE our public self-image that we put forth, right? How we choose to reveal ourselves by our communication. Not just our verbal communication, but nonverbal communication. And so think of it this way. I mean, it's a lot more complex, but think of it as public self-image. Is this making sense or, okay. So subordinates from research, it shows that they're more motivated to protect not only their public self-image in the workplace or in a group setting, but also the self-image of their boss or supervisor, all right? Because they report their reflection of the supervision they have or the leadership they have. And what's interesting though, research also shows that, see, research can be fun and interesting, okay? And hopefully that will come across today after the end of the presentation. But supervisors are not as motivated to protect the self-image of their subordinates. They're not as motivated. So what happens is the subordinate, because why? The subordinate needs to keep their job. They need a paycheck, right? They need to put food on the table. They need to pay the bills. So they have to keep that in mind. That's just the basics. But then think about what if they want to get promoted? What if they want to get a good performance review? What if they want to be nominated for an award? What if they want to have a reference letter if they apply to another job? So all these things that they're trying to, and they're going to try to manage the impression their boss has of them. So they might not be saying certain things to their supervisor, but you've heard of, and this should be reviewed too, of water cooler conversations, the rumor mill, grapevine. And think about Undercover Boss. It's a TV show. How many of you are familiar, by a show of hands, by Undercover Boss? Okay, so it's a TV show where the main boss goes into the organization disguised. Like literally they'll change the hair color and the subordinates will start talking. And it's like a rumor mill. And so they're seen, and obviously they have to get permission to show everything because these people are really exposing some things. There was one episode too where they're like, oh, the leader just doesn't understand, doesn't know. I mean, it was really just really explicit. So it's interesting because you're gonna, the dialogue is gonna be rich here, right? And so what's happening is that they're a subordinate, based on what this is saying, and we'll look at some more research, is not gonna be as open and direct, right, when they're the upward communication. So more research says, as I've alluded to, that subordinates are usually, if they comply with, if they defer to, if they agree with their supervisor, and yes, obviously they have their own opinions, but if they're more likely to be like, oh, that's a good idea, or oh, I believe, her suggestion is a good suggestion, and they're not as outspoken in a tactful way about what they would do, there usually is a greater chance for a more positive performance review, which indirectly, okay, if you get a positive performance review, that means you have a greater chance of a promotion, which usually means a greater chance of a pay raise if there's money in the budget, right? Okay, so, but interestingly enough too, it goes on to say, am I building my case here, are you seeing this? That subordinates, they reported, and they said it's so prevalent in the workplace that at least one time, if not more times, they didn't want to bring up something to their supervisor, even if it was important, because they felt like they couldn't. Mum's the word. That's a hint for the mum effect, okay? They felt like they had to keep mum, that they couldn't say anything because, again, they were trying to manage their face, okay, face work. They were working out this public self-image, and they wanted to not give what might be considered negative feedback to their leader because they didn't want, I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm so excited, but they didn't want that to be associated with them. Oh, sorry, I just touched my mic. Okay, so the top two reasons, and this is just reiterating what I've been saying to build my case to show the evidence of this. And maybe you can, I would love to hear it later at the end if you want to share of like, yes, I have witnessed this. You don't have to give names of places or people. But the top two common reasons that subordinates did not give feedback, especially if it was negative, okay, to the supervisors was one, that they were in fear that they would be labeled negatively or viewed negatively. And because if that's negative feedback, that they'd be associated with that negative information, the negative message. And then 2, they felt like it could damage that relationship. So if you go back to communication competence, they're afraid that it's going to harm the relationship. So they are thinking about, okay, task, relationship. Task, they have to do their jobs well, but does that mean giving negative feedback? That needs to be clearly communicated also from the top. Okay, so you have this predicament of tact versus truth. And more times than not, it's tact that's usually rewarded over truth. And even though like, be completely honest, and you're like, no, I would like to get a raise. I would like to keep my job. I would like to be promoted. I need to pay my bills. I need to have this job. So this becomes this predicament. So we saw this from subordinate to supervisor. But think about if you had a friend, because our supervisors can be our friends too, right? More likely we're going to probably be, closer with our coworkers. If it depends on the culture and the climate of the place and the setup of the organization. But say you had a friend that wrote a report, okay, it's a coworker of yours, they're really proud of their work, but it's written poorly, it's incoherent, and then proudly they say, what do you think? This predicament, right? Because also too, even with a coworker, how close are you? Could they go tell the boss that you spoke negatively? I mean, we've got all this going on and it creates this predicament for the individual. And so hopefully, if the individual's been trained well, here at Fort Hays, they'll be thinking communication competence, okay? Balancing task, relationship. So this leads to what's called the mum effect theory, which I'm sure you've observed but just never known, like it's actually put in a theory frame. So this theory had never been, well, to our knowledge as researchers with my colleagues and I, had never been studied in an organizational setting. And it's simply saying that individuals are in fear or afraid to give negative feedback, just like we saw with the research before, because they're afraid they'll be associated or labeled, negatively, because it's in relation to this negative feedback, and that it could harm or damage the relationship. Well, what my colleagues and I, and they're my friends too, and my coworkers, that we propose this hierarchical mum effect. Because if we're seeing from research that subordinates really don't want to, if they're afraid that it's going to harm their, the workplace environment, their relationship with other people, they're not going to be as likely to share negative feedback, upward communication. Okay? So this is what we propose. So we're saying that subordinates are less likely to share negative feedback to their supervisors in fear of them being labeled with the message associated with it, and then that will harm or damage the relationship. Okay, I've just been saying negative feedback, but think like what would be an extreme example of negative feedback that a coworker or a subordinate would have to give to their supervisor?
I would say the faculty survey that got released before it was supposed to be released.
Oh no.
There was a fear of negative feedback in that. There were people who were not ready, the mum effect, they were not ready to address it.
Yeah.
And the people who raised it, the whole issue was you were evaluating people who were above you. So definitely, everyone who filled that out, we filled that out on our supervisors. We did not fill it out on our coworkers. We were not going down. It was
right.
going up. And so, I think from relatively here, when they said, hey, we weren't ready to release that when somebody had, even though they had posted it on a public site where anybody could have found it.
Right.
To me, that, other than the extreme thing when your girlfriend comes out of the bridal studio and she's got the big bow on her back and says, how does this dress look? And you go,
and there was the expression that I've heard too is like with a dress, or even like this is in organizational comm literature, that someone says about a dress, big, I'm not a bow fan.
How do I look?
I'm not a bow fan.
Me
That's my
either.
personal, okay? The bow, or you just give a presentation or write a report and they're like, oh, what'd you think? You're braver than I. Is that really answering? Is that really answering the question? It's a great point too. So, but I want to get back to this about the feedback on the supervisor. Was it anonymous? Obviously.
Yes.
Okay, I would hope.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Will you remind me at the end, because I do want to talk about anonymous feedback channels, especially with technology. Okay. So interesting. So you've got that as far as people aren't ready to address, or maybe they haven't been properly trained on how to address the situation. If this is released, and then how are we going to respond to the feedback?
what's the intent? What was the intent from the beginning?
And the motivation, and then how are those people on the other side going to speak to the large crowds outside the building? What else? What can you think of other examples of that people, like that's negative feedback that would be in that category or classified as? I'll throw one out, and if you think of one, or are you going to say something? I didn't mean to cut you off.
There's sometimes there's a feeling among subordinates that if I disagree with what the supervisor has already said he or she wants, and I disagree,
yes,
I'm not going to be asked to serve on this committee again, or I'm not going to be asked to provide my feedback in the future. So I'm in a difficult situation here. If I'm honest,
right, and you're asked to be honest.
And I'm asked to be honest. What long-term effect is that going to have on my future relationship with the supervisor?
Right, and
the supervisors put together a task force. Do they just want people in the task force to agree with them?
Right.
Or are they really asking for a diversity of opinion? And sometimes you don't know.
Right. Oh, and that's so sad too, because they're like, yes, be honest and open, give us your feedback.
I always say, do you really want,
right?
You know, when somebody asks me that,
right,
and I always say, is that really what you want? And are you really prepared to hear that?
Right. And that's part of, I mean.
And if they hesitate, then clearly they're not really ready to hear that.
Right.
And
they want to surround themselves with yes people.
Yes.
Of course. Of course. There's that movie Yes Man, right?
Yep.
With Jim Carrey. Right. And actually that's one of, again, I'm jumping because I'm so excited, but we'll get to that, about practical recommendation to leaders. You have to fight this mum effect. You can't have hurt feelings. I mean, you need to get over the fact of if you're asking people.
It's not personal.
Right. You have to be ready. But then also training the people when they're giving feedback, not to be the yes person, but okay, would you like this feedback framed? You know, so it's not as hurtful possibly. These are all great examples. I know this, I was thinking of a family member of mine too that were like, I wonder why I wasn't asked on this committee in an institution where she works. And she said, maybe it's because I'm so outspoken. But she was like in her head wondering why she wasn't asked to be a part, which would make logical sense that she would be asked to serve on this committee. An example, I mean, these are all great examples too, but see, I think it's making that connection of, okay, this is theory and research, but we see this happen all the time. You know, we might not know it's called the mum effect or proposing this hierarchical mum effect, but, and I wouldn't encourage you to be like, oh my gosh, hierarchical mum effect is happening right now. You know, I mean, it's good if you can recognize it.
And let me quote the author.
I don't encourage you to, please don't quote me if you're going to use it in that way.
Yeah.
So, but an extreme that we were just seeing, and obviously, I mean, you all have witnessed too, a prevalence of unethical behavior in the workplace. I mean, that's like, if you're talking like extreme, right? So if someone in the workplace knows of an ethical behavior going on, nonverbal or verbal, whatever it is, and they are asked or they feel like they need to give that feedback, which would be negative, right? It's not something good happening, then that is a major thing, and we see that. I mean, sadly, it's growing in the workplace. I mean, you turn on the news and there it is, sadly. So what we decided to do is, let's look at how people in the workplace, supervisors, subordinates, coworkers, so subordinate to subordinate, would deal with unethical behavior in the workplace, how they would report it to one another, okay, and especially a request of this. So what we did is we surveyed working adults, and this is where I'm going to ask you, you don't necessarily, I have extra paper, I'm going to present you with a scenario that we actually presented our participants. And these are working adults. And there are one of 3 different scenarios you could have been placed in. And I'll show you later on. But in this scenario, I would like you to respond, and if you have your laptop too, you can write it, but how you would actually respond if you were the participant in this study. I have paper here too. You don't necessarily, you're not going to turn this in, so you don't have to worry about spelling. And you're welcome to share when I ask you to share, but you don't have to, because you can kind of evaluate on your own when I show you the coding scheme we used. But this is the scenario. I'm going to read it out loud, and you can read along with me, and then I'll give you just a few minutes to jot down. Okay, so one of the scenarios, your boss asks you, the bookkeeper, to write a check from company funds to reimburse a lunch. You believe the expense is unethical. Furthermore, if you write the check, no money will be left in the petty cash account for the rest of the month. In the box below, this was done online, so they had a text box. Please respond to your supervisor's request as though this were a real situation. So you're the bookkeeper, so that puts you in the place of subordinate, and that's all I'll say because that's all the participants had to know. So just a few minutes of how you would respond.
Could you give me some paper?
Oh, sure. I have pencils too. Does anyone need paper? wanting to stick together unless you want to write a book.
I do this.
Now again, you don't have to worry. You don't have to. I'm not going to ask you to stand up here and present what your response was. When we get to that point, you can actually share if you'd like, but you're not going to be forced to. Not to rush you, but I'll give you a few more minutes. But take your time. You can still evaluate where you are in the message if we have to stop you. If I have to stop you. How many people would like more time or need more time? Okay. So has anyone, you've heard of the word hypothesis? Okay, just to refresh everyone's memory. Hypothesis is an educated guess that you make, okay? You are saying, this is the research we've done, so this is what we believe will happen if we do this study, or if we ask these people these questions based on the literature that we have at hand. So we had a couple different hypotheses for this particular research, and I'm just going to address one. And so the first hypothesis, and this actually was this happened in real life. I'm not going to tell you to whom, and it wasn't me. I'm not saying that for code. But it just happened to someone, and so we thought, let's use an actual example of what happened. So the first hypothesis, I'm going to break this down into non-hypothesis terms, but this was the actual hypothesis, so you know. And if you're ever looking at an article, you can tell because it's indented and it's together, and it usually will say hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2. Okay, so it read, as you can read with me, supervisors respond to an ethical request from subordinates more directly than coworkers to coworkers who are more direct than subordinates to supervisors. So this is the layman's terms of the hypothesis, or the non-hypothesis terms. As we were talking about, we feel like subordinates to supervisors will be the least direct amongst the three different groups. Coworkers will be in the middle, and then supervisors to subordinates will be the most direct. Okay, in this downward communication, horizontal will be in the middle, and upward will be the least direct. Okay, that's what we hypothesized. So let me tell you about how we went about this study before I tell you the results. So we surveyed online through SurveyMonkey. It's a way that you can put a survey online and have people respond to it all over the world. We had 226 working adults. And we wanted to do this because even if they were a college-age student, you had to have a job, though, and you had to have been in a job for a certain amount of time. So it was really important to us that we surveyed working adults. There were 141, I get my math, I can check my math, 141 females, 85 males. Yes, okay. 26 states of the United States were represented, one person from Australia. And the average age was 39. I can check my notes just to make sure. I don't want to misrepresent, but yes, 39 was the average age. And I said 27, just corrected myself, 27 states and Australia. And what was unique about this study, or we felt as the researchers, is that it was a language production, yes. As opposed to, so you're familiar with this concept too of, instead of saying, do you agree, disagree, do you strongly disagree, not agree, what language would you actually produce? What communication would actually be produced from you if you were to be put in this situation? Now we've learned too that we probably could have asked for accounts that they actually experienced as opposed to giving them a situation that happened. You know, and you all were just giving me examples, which I appreciate, because I'm sure you could think of a time maybe where you don't have to share, but maybe where you asked to, do something unethical or you felt like was unethical. What was the feedback to the person asking you to do that? So this is what we did. when they went online and they read through the agreement and electronically signed their name, they, through a process of randomization through SurveyMonkey, okay, this survey operation online, they selected a number and they were put in one of 3 categories. So the N simply stands for the sample size, okay, the number of people, but you would have been placed in this category with the prompt. So you were the subordinate speaking to your boss or the supervisor. So the way that we actually coded was based on, remember we talking about face at the very beginning of the lecture and this public self-image? We based it off of face work, Goffman's work on how many face working strategies or how many times do you try to protect your self-image and or the public image of the other person in your message response, in your feedback to the requester. So this is what we came up with. And these are actually responses from what we, surveying the people. When I go through this, and if you want to share what you would say, I would love to hear, but I don't want you to feel forced because I know this can be a private issue. But maybe as we go through the coding scheme, see, okay, how would mine have been coded? How would my response have been coded? And if you want to share, you can, because some of these are really fascinating in the sense of, and there's actually some ones that were R-rated that I can't show in a classroom, or I choose not to. And I thought to myself, would people actually say that to their boss? Maybe, I don't know. But what we came to the conclusion after researching was that, directness, you're not direct or not direct. There's levels. There's degrees of directness. And the feedback came in the form of they're complying with the request or they're denying the request. So remember, we've been talking about feedback. And so you're not just direct or not direct. There's these levels or degrees of directness. And then the feedback, it comes in the form of you're complying with my request or you are denying. And it's interesting, though, I'm not going to go back to the slide, but it said on the actual prompt, and that was exactly from the study, this isn't an ethical request. Okay, it actually tells you it is. But then it's so interesting to see the responses. So compliance was coded to 0. Yes, sir, yes, ma'am. Done. The next one was extremely indirect denial. So extremely indirect feedback, okay? I don't understand. Okay, they're not telling us that. That's what they would tell their boss. I don't understand. You don't? Because it's pretty clear what it said. Okay? But notice this, they're protecting this public self-image. Okay? They're being more, they're being more tactful probably than truthful. Maybe they don't understand and maybe that's a sign how much longer they should be working. I'm not sure. Okay, 2 was coded for indirect denial. I don't think I should write you a check for the lunch. If I do, there would be no money, which is exactly what it said, no money in the cash account, and we both don't want that to happen. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. See? Okay, and are you seeing too where yours fall in too, of like how you responded? Direct denial, I cannot honor your request, as I feel this would compromise my integrity. They're not just saying they're not going to do it, they're giving you a reason why. Okay, and they're bold about this. Okay. Extremely direct denial, request denied, and this is where we had some explicit responses too, if you can imagine. Okay. So, but this is how we coded the responses. So, the results actually indicated what we hypothesized or what our educated guess was. And I know it's hard to see here, but you can actually just visually see, from the back, that subordinates were significantly less direct than coworkers to coworkers or supervisors to subordinates. So just look, we weren't surveying cows. This says cow to cow. And super obviously stands for supervisor and subordinate. So supervisor to subordinate. And this is, we're talking directness, so the most direct. Slightly below, this is coworker to coworker, not cows, okay? That just slightly less than all the way down here, subordinates to supervisors. Okay, I'm a visual learner, and this is like, I can see this, right? So it was what, and we actually, some other of our hypotheses that males were more direct than females. It didn't, and there's more detail to that too, because obviously you have the complication of how long have they been at the workplace, etc. But I wanted to cover this one in particular as it relates to feedback and listening. So what were some of our conclusions? Well, when it deals with an ethical request, subordinates are meek. They're more, compliant. They're not going to be as outspoken in this response because, again, they're trying to protect their public self-image. They're trying to protect the public self-image of the boss. They wouldn't want to say anything against or, oh my gosh, you're unethical. Why would you ask me to write a check from company funds? I'm appalled. Leaders need to learn to listen through the indirectness. They need to expect it. Okay, if they know just by your placement, even if you consider yourself the, the friendliest person, or you feel like that there's the immediacy, which means like the closeness, people feel like they can come talk to you, still by your position and title, your official title, your status, people, even if they think you're a nice person and that you'll hear them out or really listen, by that title too, leaders just need to be aware that this will happen, that there is going to be indirectness because people would like to be in good standing with you and thus be in good standing with the organization, keep their jobs. In regards to unethical behavior in the workplace, a persistence of this behavior will continue on unless it is, recognized early on, if people can pay attention to it, and in the early initial steps of things happening, if someone will speak out and say something and attention can be given to it initially. But again, I think about, are people prepared? Do they know how to respond to feedback, especially if it's hostile or if it's negative? Are people trained in the workplace to do that? So being prepared and aware, are the supervisors aware of how to tell the subordinates, this is how you need to come to us when unethical behavior is taking place in the workplace? So when we're talking about feedback, someone's actually communicating something, so you have to have a receiver, you have to have a listener, right? Okay, the basic model of communication, sender, receiver, sending the message, receiving. So this research on listening, though, and this concept of communication bravado, not just leaders, but people in general think they're pretty good communicators. They think they're pretty good listeners. There's this communication boldness. And then research goes to back that up. And of this particular study, managers who were actually deemed by their subordinates in the lowest quartile, the lowest, okay, actually rated themselves, okay, as good or very good listeners, when by their subordinates they were actually ranked in the lower, okay, of all, which is fascinating because I know I am guilty of it myself. We can say, oh, but I really feel like I am, but then I know I have trouble with interrupting, but it's just me wanting to empathize and sympathize, like I get what you're saying, and they just need someone to just listen. So to keep that in mind, when leaders are thinking about how are we going to approach this, okay, how are we going to train people? Are we actually going to listen? And then to ask ourselves, are we good listeners? Would our subordinates, those we oversee, those we work with, not just those that you oversee or manage, would they think that we're good listeners? So some recommendations we have, and this is where I want to go back to that conversation and ask you all what you think. The recommendations we have, as I mentioned before, for leaders, so if we were to take this back, which is great about research, it is socially significant, okay? It's not just to be published, but it is actually to help people in the workplace. But again, for leaders to really know that, and to expect indirectness, like we just talked about, from their role, their status in the organization. And then also fighting this hierarchical mum effect, as we were talking about with your example, Patty, of you don't overreact to hurt feelings, okay? Mm-hmm. Set it aside maybe, and maybe that's why it's good to have a board or a group of people that can listen, also, and so they can kind of put things in perspective for you. Also, too, as we were talking about, too, invite disagreement. And disagreement, people I know oftentimes confuse with conflict. It's not the same. Okay, disagreement simply means a differing of opinions. Mm-hmm. Conflict is a difference of opinions with negative emotion behind it. Okay, there's negative feeling toward the other person. But maybe, I was just talking with Dr. Robeson about this earlier, maybe when you're in a decision-making meeting or you're in a group setting and you're talking about an important issue, maybe you have someone that you say you are going to play the role of devil's advocate. You term it something else, but they're always challenging the idea so that you have the best idea that you're putting forth. And it's not just people agreeing to agree or not, being submissive because they're the new person or afraid to speak out because they don't want to be the yes person. So, ask these questions, invite these questions. How could we improve this idea? And it might be, if you empower someone to play that role, they're more likely to speak up, and maybe they'll represent this coworker communication, the gossip, the water cooler talk, because they've been empowered to do so because they've been given the role and knowing that they represent, as opposed to just saying, Kathy's saying this. But Kathy's representing her cohort. She's representing all the people she works with. Okay, I mean this by definition, but if a leader finds someone in the workplace that is communicatively incompetent, okay, and I don't mean that you would actually go say, you're not a really competent communicator, so let's talk. Tell me what's going on, okay? But maybe you realize there's someone that's maybe strategically not balancing task and relationship. They're not as concerned about protecting their public self-image or yours. And maybe that deals with the type of relationship, maybe your friends, and they know, they're like, I know my job is safe. I don't have to worry about that. And obviously they would show you respect, you know, what they're doing. And this is where I want to invite discussion. And hopefully you can feel free to, because I'd love to hear what you have to say in the technology age that we have. But the suggestion of anonymous channels. Okay, I was just at a restaurant last Thursday. We had really good service. I said, can we tell your manager or boss that we had great service and the food was really good? He said, there are comment cards over there. You put them in a box, but they hardly look at it. And you know, that can like not motivate someone to fill it out. But I thought, you know what, I'm going to do it anyway for the sake that they do. Because I feel like so many times, you know, it's not, I'll never forget, and this isn't an anonymous feedback, but I would fly out in and out of LAX because I lived in Los Angeles. And there was one man that would always help me at this American Airlines. And I said, can I speak to your supervisor? And he's like, oh my gosh, should I do something wrong? Because everyone expected it's going to be negative, right? And I said, no, I would just like to tell your supervisor that I really appreciate how kind you've been and how helpful you've been every time I've had to travel. But isn't that sad that everyone thinks initially negative? But so these anonymous channels, going back to anonymous, that I was reading an article just about a week ago talking about anonymous communication in organizations. And now, though, especially with Fort Hays being as tech savvy as it is, and you know, the president wanting and the provost really things to be technology based, that there are actually devices for decision-making processes online. And I see you shaking your head. That's why I wanted to talk in this discussion. I have some questions that we'll go over. But you know, there's multi-rater performance reviews online that can be anonymous. And they were talking about these anonymous feedback channels through technology, so online, can actually encourage participation, because people are like, oh, I don't have to actually show my face, the literal face, okay? And they're more encouraged to participate. They actually focus more on the content than the rank in the room, or who is, you know, in what position. They feel like they can more openly communicate because they're anonymous. And there were some drawbacks, though, to these channels, these technology channels of anonymous feedback, and that it took longer. Well, you know why it took longer? Because they're actually discussing. Okay, they're really not hashing it out. You've heard that expression before, but they're really dialoguing online about it. It's not just like, oh, that's what she said. Oh, I agree with her, you know, because she's my boss. Like, you know, we're talking about being the yes person. But that the people were not as satisfied. The actual people participating in the feedback and the decision-making process weren't as satisfied. And I wonder if that was because, you know, I'm a person that likes to meet with people face-to-face or voice-to-voice on the phone. And I wonder if they actually missed that, even though there was this empowerment to speak freely in these anonymous channels. So if you think about, and I would like to just have a discussion here, if we was a larger group, maybe we'd break up into groups, but maybe we can just have a discussion like this. For you, this is for you to think about, because obviously it was anonymous for a reason. I'm not asking you to tell me, you know, of a time that you used an anonymous feedback channel. But a great example given about, you know, here at the institution, giving feedback about your supervisors that was anonymous. Have you ever used, and this is for you to think about, but I want us to talk about the last question. Have you ever used an anonymous feedback channel, whether it's the Dropbox at the restaurant? How was this feedback addressed, or did you even know how it was addressed? And was the communication that you provided, did it prove to be effective at all in the process? A lot of times if you think about it, we don't know if it does. You know, and obviously at a restaurant we're not part of the organization, but what I want to talk about in just that brief introduction, and I'm not sure, you know, I saw Patty shaking her head about being familiar with these technologies. I think about, I wonder if I would actually want to participate unless I was told this is the only way that we're going to have feedback on these anonymous feedback channels via technology. And so I'm curious with all of you, and that's why I wanted to come back to the topic. What do you believe to be benefits or drawbacks to feedback via these technologies that are anonymous? I mean, have you had experience with this? Do you think this would be helpful? I know here in an academic setting, we have the teacher class evaluations, right, where you can give feedback about your instructor in the class. But if you think about it, yes, the teacher could be considered the leader, and then the students the followers, but we're not in charge of your pay or your, you know, the compensation and you getting a raise. I mean, yes, passing the class, but I know that's an example of this anonymous feedback that we deal with in an institution, an academic setting. But have you had experience? Do you believe there are benefits or drawbacks personally? What was, I mean, the experience I know with giving feedback about your supervisor, I wonder if people actually kept mum because they were afraid. Because you know what I'm afraid of? people being able to hack the system and be like, Kathy was the one that said this. It came from her laptop at this time. That's a fear of mine. I mean, and I know that's, I've watched too many TV shows, but that's what I'm afraid of. But do you think you'd be more inclined in your workplace to use anonymous feedback channels via technology or in making decisions? So say if we were an organization and I was in charge and we had to make a decision about something and we all went into this chat room, you know, and it was all anonymous, you know, do you feel like you'd be more open to share?
Yeah, if the
Yes,
pool
yes.
is really small and the people can easily recognize.
That's what I said too.
Even if it's not small.
Yes, if I am easy, I will be easily being pointed out.
Right. That's what I.
And then that's one thing. The second is that I want to see some examples.
Yeah.
For example, see
Yeah.
what happened to other people who spoke out maybe negatively about the leadership or the institution.
Mhm.
See what happened before. And also, I'd like to know what's the positive impact I can make.
Right.
Yeah, if it's anonymous, do people
Mhm.
really care, or yeah, those are the issues that I have in mind.
And you know, I wonder too, as you say that, because I have fears too. I mean, just thinking about being a part of an organization, would there be a more, oh, it was a team effort? You know, we all made the decision together, so it wasn't like, wow, you know, Connie really spoke out in the meeting, and I'm so glad she did, because that's exactly what I was thinking, but I was not about to say that, you know, but that we'd be more like a team, you know, like, wow, we accomplished this decision together, or we answered this, you know, question together, as opposed to like, yeah, I'm so glad he said something because I'm glad he's the outspoken one because I was thinking that, but I wouldn't want to say that. But see, I'm afraid too of you, because even if now we've moved from, you know, the handwritten feedback forms to things online, even like the teacher class evaluation. But yeah, I'm still like, they're going to know how I write.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Because we do 3 that are anonymous here, and we
Okay.
don't do every one every year. The recent one about,
You're super.
right. Then we did the Great Places to Work one, which is job satisfaction type thing.
Okay.
And the other one is when we do the faculty, like the NESE, except it's the faculty side, and that's like every 3 years. They're all anonymous. But if you don't fill it out, you keep getting invitations. So somebody knows who has and who hasn't
Because
filled them
they're
out.
sending the email.
That doesn't mean that they can identify, because like when Scott and I are doing a research project and we said we want the system to still, you know, notify people who haven't responded, but we signed, we never want to know who those people are.
Right.
So this is an outside company. There's no way for us to ever know, but when you're doing it internally, you know, they don't say this is the person who set it up, this is the person who has access for information, because, and this has changed over time, but it used to be that there weren't near as many women here. And so by the time it would ask you your age, your gender.
You would totally figure it out.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so demographically, you could immediately be categorized. And so that became an issue where there were a lot of times that if it demographically, all I had to do was identify the college or the unit. I would identify the unit and I would skip all the other demographic things because I wanted to speak my mind.
Right.
Now, over time, I'm all about speaking my mind. And I, you know, that's not an issue for me. I will tell somebody. I would never do this.
Right. That's what you said. Yeah, said.
You know?
Uh-huh.
For me to write a check, I need a receipt to document the appropriate use of company funds. If you
Yes.
do not have this, please obtain the proper permission in writing for my documentation.
Yeah.
Because, you know, and some of that, there are people that I don't speak probably as freely to, but there are people that, you know, ask me, and I'm going to tell you.
And but you know what? And
You know?
And would you agree? Because I don't want to put words in your mouth. That because you know the relationship you have. So going back
Right.
to that competence, you know what is okay and what's not okay.
Right.
So that relationship,
Yeah,
balancing. it.
because there is
Yeah.
a difference, you know, because Lynn and I, we joke sometimes about, you know, Dr. Gold say something, I'll flat out just, I'll put my opinion right back there, because we do have a different type of a relationship.
Right.
Over years where some other people are like, I can't believe you said that, and I'm like, you know, he asked, and so I don't agree.
Yep. And he's asking for my feedback. And
Right, and I'm
Right.
going to tell him.
Yes, Lynn.
I come from a journalism background
Yes.
where there is traditionally, not so much today, but
Yes.
traditionally, there has been a very strong predisposition against running anonymous criticism of others.
Right. Because if you can't put your name with it,
Right.
it shouldn't be run. Right.
And traditionally, the traditional model that I was raised with
Right.
was you never ran a letter to the editor without knowing who wrote it, number one, if you were the editor. And number two, if they ask you to withhold their name, they must have a pretty good darn reason. And if the reason was so important that they didn't want their name on their letter, it probably should go to news story rather than an anonymous letter to the editor.
Right.
So because I come from that strong disposition
Right.
against anonymous feedback, I do not participate in surveys that are anonymous.
Interesting. Okay.
I do not ever fill out anything that asks for an opinion of mine unless, I never say anything unless I can sign my name to it.
Right. That's how my
I
mom
don't.
raised me too. If you,
I do
yep.
not like anonymous surveys.
Mhm.
I understand their value in the workplace, but from an ethical, personal, moral, whatever you want to call it,
Right.
background, I do not participate in anonymous surveys. I don't feel comfortable doing so. And certainly I would never put anything on the internet that I did not want 1 million people to read.
No, such a good point. And
I
yep.
would not, and I would never say anything on any kind of survey that I could not sign my name to. If I can't put my name with it, I'm not going to say it.
Right.
And that's just,
And sometimes it asks and sometimes it doesn't.
that's right. That's
And,
right.
well, my mom, I'll never forget her saying when I went off to college, if you can't put it on a billboard and sign your name to it, then don't say it.
Right.
That's what she said. I was like, got
And
it.
certainly don't ever put anything on the web that you do not want, seriously, 1 million people to
Well,
read.
and this is a-
and know that
Because
you
it
sent
still
it
creates
out.
a record even if somebody
Right.
deleted it.
Right.
And they can still find out who sent it out.
Which is hysterical to me because if people realized, not what you're saying is hysterical,
Right.
I am agreeing with you because we have Facebook now, social media, right?
Right.
And people will say, it's actually great though because I've gotten feedback from there that they didn't know I was getting feedback from because they are sharing their opinion in your mind. You know what? I might not be friends with my student because I'm not,
Right.
right?
But they're friends with somebody that I am friends with.
That I know, and I might not even be friends with. And they said, I saw this on Facebook. I'm bringing this to you as a concern, and I had to share that with people that I know, saying, I just want you to be careful because I don't think they're not saying it's anonymous, but they're thinking, oh, this will never get back to my teacher. Oh, and you know, it also is humorous to me. I mean, sad at the same time. But when people are all upset about things people have said on Facebook, or what was the first one that came out that you could put your music on?
MySpace.
Thank you, MySpace. And they're so upset, and I'm like, who put that up there? Who put the picture up there that the comments about? Oh, I did. Well, how can you be upset because you solicited, feedback about? Maybe you didn't say what is your feedback on my picture, but indirectly,
You put it up there.
you put it up there. So I with that sentiment though, in saying that, in an organization where, that is the rule of thumb and that you don't put your name with it, maybe there'd be other avenues for, the listening and the feedback and the relationship of the two, and that hopefully, I would hope in that organization, both supervisors and subordinates would be trained on how to properly give feedback effectively, and owning it. And then how the
Right.
supervisor respond to it without
Right.
taking it personal, as opposed to anonymous channels.
I would like to have more surveys also where you don't have to put your name, but you can.
Right.
Because I'm not
Right.
going to participate in a survey where I can't own it.
Right.
Where I cannot say this is from me.
And it would be nice if that was the first thing on there.
Right.
Instead of having to go through
All
20
the way.
pages to
Right.
find out that
Yes.
you can't.
Delete.
Because
Right.
sometimes it won't let you move forward if you haven't responded
Right.
to everything.
Right.
I mean,
No,
that's
so
common.
true.
And if that's true, it goes in my trash
Yeah.
instantly. So unfortunately, I don't do a lot of surveys.
Yeah, we have students on the advising survey
Mhm.
who will sign their name because
They want people to know.
They are very clear,
Mm-hmm.
some people will even put a phone number and says, if you have questions about my comment,
Right.
Now, is that the majority? No, it's not. But, and one of the things that is very unique sometimes I find is that if it's negative, they'll actually identify who they are as opposed to the
Yep.
positive.
Really? Interesting.
And that has changed since
Huh.
we have grown our virtual population.
Right.
Mhm.
Because for the most part, you're never going to see any of those people face to
Right.
face, and so it's very easy for them to
Right.
say something even on a discussion board in a class.
Mhm.
And
you know,
maybe it's
as
also-
opposed to knowing you sit in a class
Right.
and then you go post something on a discussion board with these people that you know,
Right. And I know-
in a different way.
Right. Know that immediately.
Because I've
right.
seen you, I've recognized you, you've recognized me, now you really
We've
know
had
who I
we've had
am.
an in-person interaction.
Right.
Right. Right. And I mean that I love too though that there's the option for discussion board. If you use it, that you don't allow anonymous posts because you want
Right.
people to own
Right.
what they're saying. In the last few minutes we have, and I don't want to cut anyone off from what they want to share, but does anyone have any questions or comments? Or we can still be talking about anonymous channels and feedback, but I just want to respect the time.
I did, oh, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Working
Just
indicators.
that, the mom theory.
Mom effect, yes,
theory.
yes.
It's very interesting to me because that reminds me another theory called groupthink.
Yes.
Yeah, so are they related in any
You know
way?
what? I don't want to speak on camera as knowing yes or no. I think they are just by, my evaluation of the two because, groupthink, obviously, you're going to keep quiet because you're afraid of your role, and so you don't want to speak out against for time's sake. So I, in my eyes, they do. Do they go back as far as the theorist and collaborate? I'm not
No.
honestly sure.
I don't think
I don't think
it would
they
be
are.
something that somebody could do research.
Yes.
I would say spiral of silence.
Yes,
Well,
another-
Yeah.
Yes, and that was going
Yes.
to be a connection I was going to ask you about, whether
Yes.
there had been any research done that between connecting those two things.
That I know of, I'm not aware of any, but again, what I love is research that allows for other research, that welcomes it.
Yes.
So I think that would be great to investigate,
Well, and
to
it
see
would
if
be
there
neat
is.
to do with a progression study.
Yes,
Where
over
you
time.
maybe take people who were born in the Depression and you have them,
Right.
and then you take somebody from the 60s maybe, and to really, because in my listening class they used to have to do things where they would have to pick something and they would have to go have somebody in their age group,
Right.
somebody in their parents' age group, and somebody in that next generation.
Oh, I
So
like
3 generations to get what is their impression of what they've just heard. So that they
Yeah.
realize that just because I think it, my friends think it, doesn't mean the population
Right.
thinks the same thing. And so the mum effect, and gender-wise, the mum
Yes.
effect over years, I think would be very interesting.
Well, and technology and the advances of technology,
Yeah.
because you see people texting and I'm having a conversation. I'm like, oh, I'll talk to you later. No, I'm listening.
Yeah,
Well, I need to look you in the eye
Yeah.
when I'm talking.
Yeah.
you
So-
just need to do FaceTime, don't you?
Yes, I do, and that's actually something I asked for my birthday was
Yeah.
a new phone.
With
So
FaceTime.
we'll see.
Happy
We'll see.
birthday.
Thank you. But I could see how they're very related too, and keeping mom, that in a group setting, someone keeps mom because they're afraid to speak out. For sure.
There's an interesting phenomenon in China that's occurring where millions do hear anonymous posts, and it's changing the government in China. I
Really?
mean, major judicial decisions have been rescinded simply because people have anonymously, by the tens of thousands have commented and said no. And one of them was a death sentence for a young man.
Yeah. And it's really
Wow.
interesting, and part, obviously my awareness is because of our partnership, that there's
Right.
been an increase in awareness, but just even over the time that we've had those partnerships, the difference in the things the Chinese government has chosen to block,
Yes.
to not allow, like
Because
Facebook
I
and
talked
things.
about that in my
Yes,
last meeting
and
class.
so, and I think part of that is because the influence of the outside
Hmm.
comes in, and, who are you to change our culture?
Right.
But it's just like anybody, if we go travel somewhere else and we may come back with a different perspective and think, hey, well, I want to try this. I want to do something a little bit different, more interesting. And, it's the same thing, but
It's interesting, though, that social media is allowing democratization to take place in totalitarian regimes that has never taken place before because of
the
the
advancement.
protection
Yeah.
of anonymity.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
There's
Yeah.
so
I have
many
to-
studies could be
I may have
done.
to ponder that to see if my
Beca-
total
yeah.
animosity towards anonymous feedback
Because,
is
Right.
changed.
There is
Right.
a
Yeah.
result that comes.
There's
because
that's
is
good
it
that I've
really
learned that.
anonymous? Because ultimately, if a crime is involved, and if you're a government organization, let's get real, whether there's a crime or not, they can go check it out. Because a student can send me an email that tells me they're in danger, and I can call over and I say, I need to know where it comes from. University police track it to the exact place so we can help that student. So even in things when that's not the case,
Yeah.
ultimately it can be done, and there's more and more in place to allow anonymity to not really be
anonymous.
Anonymous.
Yeah.
And see, that's where I watch too many, like, you know,
Crime shows.
crime shows.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Like,
And
they
hack-
could actually go into the computer and really, but like you were saying too,
They can.
they keep sending
Oh,
emails
yeah.
out to the people that haven't responded. Well, how do they know? You know?
And that's very real,
Yes.
because a student threatened their life on this campus in the last 2 weeks, sent me an email. The email was tracked to exactly where it came from, for the good.
And they didn't want it to be anonymous indirectly, probably.
Right.
Right.
You know, they said who they were, but we had
Oh,
to
okay.
find them. We had to
Right.
find them. And so technology has, oh, they just bounced off of this Verizon tower, you know, to where people
Yeah.
can really do things, and it depends on how savvy you actually are, because
Right.
I think we do have a lot of students who put it out there and they think nobody's ever going to know I put it out there. That takes like 2 minutes.
You can't erase it.
Right.
That's what-
It's
yeah,
not
that's
really.
true, yeah.
Forensically, it's still there.
Yes.
The footprint
In
is still
cyber,
there, even
yeah.
though you
Yes.
think you took the page down.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you all for your time and your input. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathy.
Oh, you're welcome. And if you don't have my email address, I can give it to you later if you'd like, if you have any further questions. Or would love to collaborate on future research too. Because I think ethnicity